Hello, everyone. This is Jeremiah Roberts, one of the co-hosts here at Cultish. I want to give you a heartfelt thanks for those of you who have generously given and supported our ministry the last few months. It's been very, very helpful. We do, however, need additional support as we head into 2025. Currently, we are operating roughly around 35 to 40% of what we need to operate on a monthly basis. So if you've been blessed by our content that we've been able to release to you, we'd ask that you would prayerfully consider partnering with us and be part of the mission to impact and change lives. Go to thecultistshow.com. There is a donate tab. You can donate one time. You can become a monthly supporter. All that goes directly towards helping us create more content. It'll allow Andrew to support his family as he is also a pastor up in Utah. And it would allow us to continue this important mission to engage the kingdom of the cults. So all that being said, enjoy this next podcast. All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Cultish. My name is Jeremiah Roberts, one of the co-hosts here. I am flying solo as at the time of this recording, as I mentioned before. Andrew's lovely wife, Casey, they're expecting their fifth child. So again, I am running the ship today along with my good friend Myles from Answering Adventism. Good to have you back, man.
It's great to be back.
Awesome. So we spent the last episode kind of everyone learning about you, who you are, what you're passionate about, in this case specifically Seventh-Day Adventism. We just started to kind of scratch the surface of the theological distinctions, because that's really what it comes down to, and that was my biggest takeaway from our initial series. Again, this is a continuation of the initial Seventh-Day Adventism series we did about 2 years ago. You can check that out in our previous podcast feed. But yeah, I just realized, like, walking away, like, man, it's really, really kind of murky having to try and understand how to make sense of the language barrier when it comes to Adventism. It was a puzzle, pun intended, for Walter as he kind of typed that in his appendix, but that's a real challenge. So with that being said, let's jump back right into it. You were introducing the great controversy theology, the great controversy worldview, and what you were explaining is it's a distinction, it's a prequel between Genesis 1 and when the angels fell from heaven, when God created the world. And that redefines everything. So if you could just expand, maybe give a quick recap of that, and let's continue the conversation and continue to expand upon the theological distinctions.
Yeah. So like we were talking about in part one is, as Christians, we believe the Bible is a revelation of redemptive history from the beginning into the eschaton eternally. And in the Adventist framework, they would say the same thing, that the Bible is a revelation of redemptive history, but they have a bigger timeline of redemptive history than the Christian does. They have a bunch of information through the writings of Ellen White, allegedly from God, regarding what was going on prior to the Earth's creation with the angels in heaven. Now, they don't know how long that period of time was. It's just that there was a lot of stuff going on prior to Earth's creation, and the creation of the Earth actually was done while this controversy between Jesus and Satan was already underway. And so because of that, that influences the way that they teach the Bible, what they claim about the Bible, their interpretations of the Bible, etc. And unfortunately, a lot of times Seventh-day Adventists, they're not really neck deep in the systematics of things, just like, I'd say the vast majority of Christians in your evangelical church, for example, are not theology nerds. Mm-hmm. They're not studying systematics, these sorts of things. So whether Adventists understand this or not, they're being taught and equipped in Seventh-day Adventism to have this worldview. And on my platform, I refer to Adventism as a corporation. It operates far more like a business, and they need customers, and it's essentially the individuals who come in, and the product that they are selling is the great controversy worldview. It is this all-encompassing sort of mindset that influences not just all of their theology, but the way that they see everything in the world, current events, everything.
And as far as when you say corporation, you're talking about like an official headquarters and every other Seventh-day Adventist church. I've got a few that I had one I drove by the other day, and it came to mind, like, oh, I'm going to have a conversation about that. But is it kind of like where there's just a one corporation and then every other building is a sort of like a Jimmy John's franchise, or maybe expand what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I use that language to make a point for people. Now, there is obviously the registered corporation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They incorporated in 1863.
Mm.
And so they do have a formalized corporation. I'm more so referring to the way that they function and operate is a lot more like a business. It
Okay.
doesn't necessarily function a lot like the way you would see a standard church. They claim to affirm a Presbyterian form of church governance, but they have the most top-heavy amount of red tape um, of any church that I've seen.
Mm.
There's a ton of just administrative bloat in their movement, but you've got all sorts of administrative roles, working your way up through the conferences and the unions to the divisions, so North American Division, et cetera, all the way up to the General Conference, which is essentially the highest governing body in the church. But when I use that language and I'm saying that they're like a corporation, I'm using that to make a point that, like, if you were to go to Best Buy, they're trying to sell you all sorts of products at
Right.
Best Buy. Adventism is like that. It's like a corporation that's selling a product, the Great Controversy Worldview. That's
Mm.
what they're out proselytizing. That's what
Okay.
they're out, whether people understand that or not, like the people out doing it, the individual Adventists, whether they know it or not, they are out proselytizing when they hand out Great Controversy, like they did at the inauguration in January. Um, that was ultimately influenced by um, uh,
What do you see? Their great controversy in the inauguration. Like I watched it on TV, but
yeah, yeah. So
explain what you mean by that?
they always go to like high profile political events and they hand out copies of the Great Controversy, Ellen
Okay.
White's book.
Yeah.
And so this past inauguration was no exception. And so, but all of that stuff, like when they go out and do that, little do they know they are actually out essentially doing like marketing for the product, the Great
Mm.
Controversy Worldview. They want
Yeah.
people to
Okay.
adopt this product, and buy it because it makes a person a lifetime customer. In part one, you talked a little bit about or asked about what was it like growing up in Adventism. One thing that's really unique, Jerry, that a lot of people are kind of shocked to hear sometimes is the SDA Church has their own fake meat product or products, I should say. And
Mm.
it's not actually, the businesses are not actually owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but Adventists know what I mean. All the products are purchased by the universities, the schools, the churches, et cetera, to use because their health message. So like there's just a number of interesting aspects. Like you don't really have like a Baptist church that has like their own meat products
Right.
that they're like trying to sell you on. Like, hey, we're going to teach you about how the Bible says you need to become a vegetarian. Hey, we've got these veggie meats over here you can buy.
Mm.
That sort of stuff is a little bit quirky. It's a little bit odd. It's one of those things from the outside looking in you may not
Right.
know about, but when you hear about, you're kind of like, well, that's a little strange.
Mm.
I just kind of took that for granted when I was an Adventist. I didn't really think much about it, but um, all of that stuff, though, is influenced by or has some sort of aspect that plays a role in the Great Controversy worldview. So they want you to come in and basically be a lifetime customer. You can go to an Adventist school, church, doctor, grocery store, etc. They have food for you to eat. They have materials for you to consume and read and be entertained by. They have events that you can go to and conferences you can go to. You can get your kids involved in their schools and pathfinders. And all of these things are essentially a part of the product that they are selling. So I'm using it in that sense. Obviously, Adventists are not going to see it in that way, but I'm saying it that way to make a
Mm.
point.
Yeah. And so for the average person who is Adventist and you've had conversations on the street, I've seen just a couple of the videos. When you're initially talking with an Adventist, like what is sort of your starting point? Because we're having obviously a conversation, but what we know there's going to be a lot of people who listen in, and I'm genuinely curious as someone who's on the outside looking in. Like, how do you explain like what you explained to me? How would you start to explain that to someone who is a committed Adventist and maybe doesn't understand even though maybe the own distinctions of the Great Controversy worldview, or maybe does, or how do you normally go about that?
So I'm not going to go full on into like the systematics with like a lay Adventist. That may be surprising.
Yeah.
But the reason why is because it can be a little weighty, it can be a little heavy. And again, the average Seventh-day Adventist is not really keyed in on these things. They're just trying to be faithful where they are. For
Mm.
the most part, they're genuine people. So the first thing I always go to, and you're going to see that in my street evangelism videos to them, is asking the question if they have peace with God. Because at the end of the day, the Seventh-day Adventist doesn't have peace with God. The by the book card carrying Seventh-day Adventist cannot consistently affirm Romans, what Paul is actually saying in Romans 5. Now you're going to get a lot of SDAs that will tell you they do have peace with God, which is going to have to cause you to start to go into apologetically, at least, pointing out some of the ways that can't be consistent based on what your system of belief teaches. But there's going to be a big spectrum out there, regardless of this narrative that they're this real united, monolith amongst all this other confusion. Adventism is by far one of the most theologically divided movements I've ever come across. And I've done street evangelism to a lot of different groups. And so they're definitely, you just never know what you're going to hear and what you're going to get. So I always go though to that very first question, and then based on their responses, that's going to kind of determine where we go. But it's really about that because they don't have the gospel. They don't actually understand what it means to have peace with a holy God. They don't really understand the nature of man being born dead in sins and trespasses and what being born again really is. You guys talked about that in your series with Colleen and Nikki a little bit, their physicalist worldview and the lack of understanding around the dead spirit of man needing to be raised to spiritual newness of life and what that really means. They teach that the Sabbath is the seal of God's law, and that only those who essentially join the remnant church before the close of probation are going to receive the seal of God. So they don't understand the Holy Spirit being the seal of God, like Ephesians 1:13 explicitly says, and that a person can really have peace with a holy God. Adventism really kind of teaches people a hamster wheel type system where you're just constantly doing and doing and doing and doing. So it's a lot of law without really understanding what the gospel actually is.
No, I appreciate that. Jumping back to some of the very early beginning descriptions of the Great Controversy Worldview, you were saying that Satan was jealous because the Father then exalted Christ to be equal with him. As somebody who is a Christian and is familiar with understanding the deity of Jesus and his equality with the Father, knowing that Jesus was eternally God, that immediately raises a red flag as far as what that means about the deity of Christ. Again, we're defining terms. So when it comes to Jesus and his eternal and his nature, who is the Jesus of Seventh-day Adventism, and how do we make sense of that in contrast to the biblical Jesus that we know that we test all other cults by?
So it's a good question, and it's a little bit of a weighty one in the sense that I have to do a bit of explaining here.
Sure.
You have to kind of understand the way that Seventh-day Adventist theology developed. And the problem for them in this area is not that they have come around to some things being correct, like the present-day Adventist is going to tell you, we believe Jesus is co-equal and co-eternal with the Father, because they're going to disagree, obviously, with their pioneers. But like I told you previously, and you talked about this in part, or your discussion with Nikki and Colleen, they had semi-Aryan roots as a movement. And so because that's the case, you have theological development that's taking place, yet they tell us that all of Ellen White's writings are divinely inspired. So her statements in 1858 about Jesus being exalted and being given authority he didn't previously possess, and he was invested with authority and he was made equal, and these sorts of claims, you can't anachronistically go into the 1890s when Desire of Ages is published, which is where the scholarship likes to go, for example, to say, well, look, by the time Desire of Ages comes around, she's basically affirming the Trinity. It's like a form of like social Trinitarianism, right? But you told us that the statements she made in 1858 are just as divinely inspired as the ones in 1890, yet they can't both coincide with one another. So that's the problem on this issue, because Adventists get real squirmish when you bring this up. They get real defensive. They say this is one of the key ones that they're going to tell you, you're taking that out of context. You're not taking it out of context. You just have to understand the history around what's going on there, that there was a semi-Aryan root that over time they eventually abandoned. They now will tell you that they affirm the Trinity, but what they actually affirm is their own concept that Ellen White called the heavenly trio. And it is three distinct beings that are united in a mission and a purpose. They're never at cross purposes. So that's supposedly what makes them one God. Now, we can get into that a little bit if you'd like, but with regards to the exaltation of Jesus, yes, it does call into question those sorts of things, but you might be shocked to hear this as well. Key to their model is and their framework is that the Adventist Jesus is Michael the Archangel. Now, when most people hear this, to be fair to Seventh-day Adventists, they falsely accuse the Seventh-day Adventist Church of believing the identical thing that Jehovah's Witnesses do. This is incorrect. And if you don't understand the difference on this and you go to talk to an SDA and you bring this up, I see this a lot. This is an area people love to go to. You have to understand the difference between what the two parties are saying. The Jehovah's Witnesses are saying that he's the greatest creation of Jehovah, that he was created. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is not going to say Jesus is created. The present-day Christology is not going to say that. The pioneers also didn't say that. Now, they had some wonky statements where they said things like, Jesus had a beginning, but he wasn't created. Basically, he came forth from the Father at a point so far in the past, it's basically eternal to us. That was kind of their thinking.
Yeah.
But when they talk about Jesus being Michael the Archangel, get this. This is from an issue of Signs of the Times, which is an official SDA publication, where they are speaking about Jesus taking on an angelic nature when he sought to seek and save the angels prior to incarnating as a man. So this is an interesting aspect that's coming from the great Controversy Worldview. So ultimately, before I read the quote, what they're essentially saying in this quote is that in order for Jesus to vindicate God's law before all the watching intelligences, since man fell and angels fell, it was necessary for Jesus to go on the plane of both of those beings, on the plane of angels and the plane of humans, and demonstrate that Satan is a liar because God has to vindicate his character. So before incarnating as a man and coming to the earth, the great controversy narrative has Jesus taking on the nature of an angel and living the God life on the angelic plane to vindicate the law before the angels that rebelled with Satan, to try and save the angels, but none of them responded. So then he incarnated as a man. So when they talk about Jesus being the Michael the Archangel, you can't fall for this idea that, no, angel just means messenger. No, listen to these quotes. Quote, Signs of the Times, June 6, 1911. The eternal word gave himself. He did not aspire to be equal with God, did not meditate a usurpation of the throne of the universe, Philippians 2, 5-7. But he emptied himself, gave himself then and there for sinners. He took the form of a servant, becoming an angel among the angels, that he might redeem angels, but they would not. And when they rejected the righteousness and life so freely offered, he descended lower still to those duped by Satan, fallen man, stooping even to death, that he might redeem the fallen of all who desired to be redeemed and vindicate the universe to all eternity the character of God. That was the work of the Word of God, the eternal Logos, when he became Michael the Archangel, when he became Jesus, the man of Nazareth, when he was anointed the Christ, when he died our sacrifice on Calvary. Yet during all this time, the hosts of evil, with all the baleful, deceptive, cruel devices of sin, were hurled against him, that God's character might be marred, that the great vindicator redeemer might fall. Close quote. One more here. A year later in the same publication, Signs of the Times, July 23rd, 1912. Quote, he, talking about Jesus, took the nature of angels to repeat the first step then in his humiliation. In laying aside his divine nature, so like they said the year prior using Philippians 2, they affirm the kenosis heresy, by the way, that Jesus on earth set his divine nature aside. Let me start this quote over again. Sorry. He took the nature of angels to repeat the first step then in his humiliation in laying aside his divine nature was to put on the nature of angels. And thus it is that we have Jesus brought to view as Michael the Archangel, the commander of the hosts of heaven, the captain of the hosts of the Lord. And as such, the armies in heaven follow him. When he became an angel, he bore a fitting name, even as when later he became a man. His name befitted the nature which he took by virtue of his birth into our human family. That name was Emmanuel, God with us. His name as an angel is Michael, which signifies the one who is like God. Whatever the name that he takes in crushing sin and rebellion, in redeeming the lost and in restoring harmony to the universe, that name must indicate that God is in him and with him on the very plane and in the very nature of the class of beings to whom he is sent. By living the God life on the plane of angels, of which Satan was one, although fallen, he could neutralize the force of Satan's accusations. Thus, when he became an angel, the fact must not be lost sight of that he was God with the angels, yet living on their plane, possessing their natures, and this thought is preserved in the name that he bears as an angel. Close quote. So this is a perfect example. The Bible says none of this. The Bible, I mean, Hebrews 2, for example, says he helps the offspring of Abraham. That's why he's not ashamed to call us brothers, that he came to seek and save humans. Yet prior to him coming to seek and save humans, in this storyline, they have Jesus taking on the nature of an angel on the plane of angels, and it was to vindicate the law that Satan began accusing and started this controversy over, because in order for God to clear his name, he had to vindicate the law before the angels on their plane. So this is just an example of how you get all sorts of extra stuff being brought and taught that is not in the Bible, very clearly not in the Bible, yet they'll tell you doesn't contradict the Bible. And so they have their arguments for why they claim Jesus is Michael the Archangel. But all of that to say, do not fall for this claim that this organization does not teach or has not taught that Jesus is an angel by nature, that he has an angelic nature. They oftentimes will argue that and say, we're not saying the same thing as the Jehovah's Witnesses, right? You're not saying that he was a created being, but clearly in this storyline, they're saying he incarnated as an angel, taking on their nature. So,
how familiar is the average Adventist today with everything you described, just about who Jesus is and with him having an angelic nature according to SDA theology and quoting some of their primary sources? How familiar are they with that, and how do they handle if you were to tell them that, how would they respond?
They're not. They're not. The average SDA is not plugged in on this stuff, and we are grateful for the mass amount of Adventists that reach out to us every year and let us know, I didn't like you at first. It really rubbed me the wrong way. I was really jaded. I was really defensive, but I kept listening, and then I started checking the sources, and I realized, wow, that is what's being said. Mm-hmm. So we're grateful to red pill, to use a modern term. We're grateful to red pill a lot of Seventh-Day Adventists, and we have a lot of that because the average SDA, they're not familiar with this stuff. And you also have to think, too, this is 1911, 1912. They were a lot more forthright back then. This is pre-questions on doctrine. This is why I think Walter Martin was duped, because if you read question 8 in Questions on Doctrine, which I have an original copy of, the way they word it in there, the whole focus, they put it on them saying, we don't believe the same thing as Jehovah's Witnesses. So they weren't lying. That's correct. They don't believe the same thing as Jehovah's Witnesses. But if you actually understand the language gap and the barrier, you can see how the way they worded things in that specific question and answer was to basically be innocuous. It allows them to still uphold what we just read from Signs of the Times, while also still uphold the claim that they're not saying the same thing as the Jehovah's Witnesses. Walter wouldn't have known to pry behind that claim beyond just, the Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Jesus is a created angelic being. And so are you saying the same thing as them? No, we're not. Here's what we're saying by Jesus being Michael the Archangel. And again, the answer they put forth, it allows for what I just read for them to still uphold that, but also not be lying to Walter Martin, if that makes sense. Yeah. It's very, very slippery.
Yeah, and maybe you can give commentary on this too, and maybe you kind of articulate this, made me think of this too. We were texting over the weekend, and as I was listening to that podcast critique of our initial series, and when she was, real quickly, define Arianism, because we mentioned a couple times, Colleen mentioned it in her podcast, and they brought that up in responding to us. Just define that for our audience.
Yeah, so Arius was a bishop in the early church who basically believed that Jesus was not the Almighty. He was not God. He was essentially the first creation of God. And so the pioneers of the Seventh-Day Adventist Church were not full-blown Arians. They would be classified as what you'd call semi-Arians.
Yeah. And the reason I bring that up is that, and even talking about familiarity and maybe just how modern day Adventists are polarized. There's a broad variety of different beliefs and views, and they're somewhat polarized against each other. Is that in that podcast when they were giving the critique, one of the things they mentioned is that they did play some clips where Colleen mentioned the Arian aspects of their Christology, and it seemed that they were trying to say, no, that's not what we are. But at the same time, in the very next breath, they admitted that this is an issue with a lot of the older Seventh-Day Adventists having this sort of view. So it almost seemed like they were having it both ways, trying to have their cake and eat that too. Would that be kind of like an example of just sort of not being able to really separate or untangle from the initial foundations of their Christology?
Well, that's the evidence that in 1858, you can't read back into Ellen White your post 1890 beliefs. The reason you have the old path Adventist who rejects the heavenly trio, they reject the Trinity, and they're in favor of the pioneers, is because early on they were semi-Arians. The movement was semi-Arian, and Ellen White was supporting that. So both parties can point to Ellen White for statements on both sides. You can point to statements of hers that would classify as semi-Arianism. Then you can point to statements of hers that would uphold their current, heavenly trio view. So the problem is the doctrinal development, with the wrench in the gears being, you're telling us that both of these are divinely inspired, yet they contradict one another. They can't both be true. So you have a serious problem there. And so some of their scholarship is honest about this when they're in, writing scholastic works and those types of things, because they have, scholarly integrity. And so they know, but the average person in the pew is a little bit of a different story, just because you don't know what you're going to get, because like I said, it's just a really confused mess of inconsistency, and really not knowing the history. Again, if you don't understand, I always cite, you'll see me in my presentations on our website, when I'm citing stuff from like the Great Controversy narrative, I'm typically always going to cite from Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, which goes back to 1858, because I'm doing that for a reason, because I know Adventists love to appeal to Desire of Ages, Great Controversy 1911, these sorts of things, where you have all this stuff over time where it's developed, and that ends up just proving that, well, both of these can't be divinely inspired, and you have a serious problem here. So that's why you have that division, though, is because they both have support.
And internally, there may be Adventists who would disagree one with another. But generally speaking, what would be the hierarchical? What would be the hierarchy per se of the of authority? Or do you have the Bible? You mentioned the one volume that you appealed. What was the volume you just mentioned?
Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1.
Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1. So you're looking at by the Bible, writings of Ellen G. White, and she didn't add to the Bible; she expanded upon it. And then obviously you have the modern day hierarchy, the organization, the corporation, what have you. But just when it comes to like revelational authority, like what's hierarchy as far as Ellen White's teachings, the Bible, how's it all fit into play?
Yeah, so they're going to be adamant and tell you that the Bible is supreme. The Bible is, they're big on not sola scriptura, but nuda scriptura. They conflate sola scriptura with nuda scriptura. Sola scriptura is very specifically the belief that the Bible is the only infallible rule of faith and practice, the only infallible rule of faith and practice. The Seventh-Day Adventist Church has multiple rules of infallible authority. People that want to see the sources on this can just go to answeringadventism.com. In the search bar up top, type in the word infallible, and you will see the article there. Everything in red is hyperlinked, and it'll take you right to the sources. But the Adventist Church has multiple sources of infallible authority, but here's what they're going to tell you. Ellen White said that she was the lesser light that points to the greater light, which already out of the gate, you're kind of like, well, why do I need a flashlight in the sun? It just kind of is seemingly contradictory. But her writings are supposed to be a lesser light to the Bible, which is a greater light. They're supposed to point you to the Bible, but they give you extra details that the Bible does not say. And so they're not going to tell you that her writings are above the Bible, but that they are supplementary to the Bible to help you actually really understand the normative character of such. I'm going to read a statement here from the Statement of Confidence in the Writings of Ellen G. White, which is put out by the GC, by the way. This is on their website. I cite this all the time. It is not hidden. It's not secretive. They're very forthright about this. This is coming from the GC, folks. It says, in part, We affirm our conviction that her writings are divinely inspired, truly Christ-centered, and Bible-based. Rather than replacing the Bible, they uplift the normative character of Scripture and correct inaccurate interpretations of it derived from tradition, human reason, personal experience, and modern culture. So her writings are the infallible interpreter of the Bible. That's the way they function in the organization. The people at the highest echelons, they understand this. A lot of it, I don't understand why a lot of the Adventists in the pew, well, I guess I kind of do, but I don't know specifically for every individual, obviously. I don't know why they get so adamant about trying to deny this when it's very, very forthright. And I could show you multiple statements outside of this. I've done so on our platform numerous times. She's supposed to be the infallible interpreter. So her writings can't stand alone. They need the Bible because they comment on the Bible. And they're supposed to be a divinely inspired commentary on such, helping you navigate that. Now, you'll notice the statement says her writings, period. It doesn't list a hierarchy. However, there is a little bit of an unspoken hierarchy within them, though it's not a formal thing. At the end of the day, they do believe that writings outside of this are still just as inspired. But the informal hierarchy would be her Conflict of the Ages series, which is a 5-book volume set, as well as her Christ Object Lessons, which is basically her commentary on the Christ parables, basically, from the Mount of Blessing. And so the Conflict of the Ages series has an interesting history. Spirit of Prophecy, volumes 1 through 4, and Spiritual Gifts, which is also a multi-volume set, were early books that went on to be compiled into the Conflict of the Ages series. So they love appealing to the later writings because they have a theory around doctrinal development, basically. This gets tied into their teaching of present truth, which is really just like relative truth. They wouldn't call it that, obviously, but present truth plays a big part in this. And so they love to point to the later works and say that she got a better and clearer and more biblical understanding as time went on because, well, she's a human and God doesn't override the human in inspiration and these sorts of things. So all of that to say, they're going to say Ellen White's writings are equally as inspired with the Bible, but they don't necessarily carry the same authority, which is a little bit of an oxymoronic statement. We recently did a couple of pieces on this, so people can check that out if they want. I'll save that for there. But that's essentially the argument they make, is that her writings are just as inspired as the Bible, but they don't carry the same level of authority as the Bible. But practically speaking, they do. They function as the infallible interpretive guide. And if you have an opinion that conflicts with what she has said on any given passage, it's going to be said to be tradition, human reason, personal experience, or modern culture. And you need to submit to what the organization has said, which is Ellen White.
Wow. So ontologically speaking, with the great controversial worldview, how, because you said in your earlier years, being 7 years old, 8 years old, and I was thinking, oh man, that's going to be my son in a short amount of time. I better be ready for that. But so yeah, my question would be, according to the great controversy worldview, like, who are we ontologically as beings? As I mentioned, I know that you're saying that when you're 7, 8 years old, that you are asking a lot of questions about who you are in existence. So we know that as Christians, we are made in the image of God. Who we are reflects God and His character, and we're made in His image. But given just how much confusion and disorganization as far as who Christ really is, and just in all the description that you gave previously, how does the great controversy work out into who we are ontologically as like human beings? Like, who are we?
Yeah, so there's a lot we could get into here, because this is one of the pillar doctrines of Adventism. They have 7 pillar doctrines very specifically, and this is one of them. And there's reasons for that. It plays a bigger role in their eschatology, and since the foundation of their whole system is eschatology, it kind of plays a big central role in that. But generally speaking, what you're going to get is that they're going to go to Genesis 2:7. They're going to say that man, being a living soul, is the equivalent of the breath of life being conjoined with the physical body. And that when those two things come together, you have the soul, the living soul. So the analogy I used to always hear when I was growing up was like nails and boards. If you have a pile of nails and a pile of boards, you have a pile of nails and a pile of boards. But if you put the two together, you get a box. The soul is like the box. If you take the nails and the boards apart, you no longer have the box. So the human is essentially those three parts,
Mhm.
and they are monists, to use the technical term. They believe that man doesn't actually have an immaterial aspect that is rational to his being. So they wouldn't be in harmony, say, with like the Athanasian Creed, which talks about man being both a body and a rational soul. And so it's essentially this combination of breath of life, body, resulting in a living soul. If you separate those two things, the breath of life leaves the body, it goes back to God, the body goes back to the ground. There is no actual conscious aspect to your being anymore. Your soul, I wouldn't say soul sleep. That's a term that they like to distance themselves from because of the Jehovah's Witnesses. A term I would use would be soul death. The soul actually ceases to actually really exist in any real tangible way.
Okay. And then maybe expanding on a couple of things as far as theological goes, and again, we're tying this into the great controversy worldview, is one thing that was brought up in the previous series with Colleen and Nikki was the issue of the Sabbath.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying so just expand upon that if you could, because all these are integral pieces that all kind of work together. And this is really a great reminder for me and probably everyone else listening in.
Yeah, so in part one, I read that quote from Herbert Douglas in Ministry Magazine, and there was a part in there where he talks about how all of these doctrines, and he listed them out, he used the phrase mutually supportive clusters. And what he means by that is they all support one another. If one of them is wrong, the whole thing falls apart. The binding glue, if you will, falls apart. And so this is connected with all of that. There's a lot we could get into on the Sabbath because this is just their hobby horse. This is the thing that they think is the saving grace of the movement. They think this is the thing that vindicates Adventism despite the false gospel, the false God, and all that sort of stuff. Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath is supposed to vindicate it. So, in their view, basically, you have to understand that the pioneers, while the history has it that they were influenced by a tract from the Seventh-day Baptists, um, there's actually history before that influencing both the Seventh-day Adventists and the Seventh-day Baptists because of the Seventh-day Baptists influencing the Adventists. And they were actually influenced by the Reformed tradition. They were influenced by the Reformed understanding of the law in some capacity and in some way. And so basically their belief is the same as the Reformed view of the Sabbath, minus the law gospel distinction, which is where it all goes awry, and not understanding like the proper use of the law, which is why salvation essentially gets tied to this specific commandment. Now, they're not going to tell you that you can break the others and still be fine, but their hobby horse, and what they're really getting at is the fact that they keep the seventh-day Sabbath, or so they believe, by going to church on Saturday and ceasing from their labors. And that is supposed to be an identifying mark of the true followers of God. And so in their model, the fourth commandment is the seal of God's law. And it is supposed to be the identifying mark of who gave the law, by what authority it came from, these sorts of things. The analogy you'll often hear them use is a presidential seal, is kind of like the presidential seal of the law is the fourth commandment. It tells you who gave the law, by what authority it was given, etc. And so without that, you don't know whose law it is. And so they kind of have this whole theology around those kind of aspects. But really, the eschatology of it is that in the end, Satan, Ellen White claimed in Spiritual Gifts, or Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 4. I've talked about this a number of times as well. We have an article on this actually on our website, that Satan held a council meeting in outer space to conspire on how to attack the Sabbath and Seventh-day Adventists. And part of that included the enactment of his own Sabbath, the papal Sabbath. So you have to understand their theology around the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy, which is pretty much sort of the same stuff you'd see with a lot of the reformers around their sort of historicist, papal, antichrist theology. And so they basically say that the Pope changed the Sabbath, and that is at the behest of ultimately Satan in this council meeting that he held. And part of the way that the great controversy is going to be wrapped up is it's ultimately going to come down to if you decide to submit to a Sunday law, that Satan is conspiring and there is a shadowy cabal basically being formed in the shadows between what they call apostate Protestantism, Roman Catholicism, and spiritualism. And this is ultimately going to come at the behest of that union, who is going to influence the American government to pass a national Sunday law that is going to require that all peoples rest and worship on Sundays. Once this happens, that's the point at which they believe the mark of the beast is now going to begin getting issued. If you submit to that law, which they believe to be the image of the beast, you are essentially siding with Satan and the papacy, and you're standing against God's law. And the Seventh-day Adventists are going to have to stand for Saturday. And essentially, it's going to lead to the whole world being, as Ellen said, filled with enmity towards Seventh-day Adventists. And a death decree is going to go forth, sanctioning the killing of Seventh-day Adventists for going to church on Saturday and not submitting to the Sunday law. So I know that's kind of finagled there. I'm sure a lot of people will hear that and be like, that sounds extremely insane. There's a lot of stuff to get into on that. And I'm kind of trying to give a good breeze over, if you will, but there's a lot we could get into on. I mean, that could be a series just in and of itself, all of the sort of facets that they understand regarding Sabbatarianism.
Yeah, I'll just say when I first started cultish, I never encompassed having both the Sabbath and outer space mentioned in the same podcast. So this is a first for me.
Yeah. I'm sure Adventists will latch onto that and they'll say, she didn't verbatim say outer space. Okay, folks, you can go read the source and see what she says. That's clearly what's being discussed there.
I was wondering how deep this went. Like for a second, I'm like, is he going to mention like operating thetans? Like how crazy is this going to get?
I actually utilized this in a presentation I gave responding to a guy named Mark Finley. He's a really well-known, old school type conservative Seventh-day Adventist who has a ministry called Hope Lives 365. They have a pretty big YouTube channel, but he's really well-known in the SDA world. And he gave a sermon that was titled Seven Reasons Satan Hates the Sabbath. And he started that presentation by saying, in my imagination, I see Satan holding a diabolical council session somewhere in the recesses of space. So even he recognized, I called that out in the presentation. I said, that's not his imagination. You're just quoting from Ellen White and you're not telling people, because I knew where he was quoting from.
Right.
But nevertheless, it's like Mark Finley recognized that she was clearly talking about outer space. So people can go check that.
Gotcha.
People can go check that source out for themselves and see. It's quite comical.
Okay. And so another just question I have as we kind of go into the sort of the tail end of this podcast is we're going to a couple more topics theologically as far as another piece of the chain, per se, of all these integral pieces that are all connected to the great controversy worldview. You mentioned in the first episode a little bit about the vegetarian or their veganism or their adherence to the absence of meat. Just for clarity, there's obviously a distinction between someone who's vegetarian versus someone who's a militant vegan. Like, are we talking about like full vegan, or are we talking about vegetarian, or what are we looking at when it comes to like their food regimens now, or has that changed, or what does it look like?
So there's a spectrum in the movement. You're going to get a lot of people who say, no, it's only the forbidding of unclean meat. Those people would be considered liberal Adventists typically. So that's what I'm saying when I said in part one that conservative and liberal in the Adventist paradigm don't mean the same thing that we think in terms of like politics. So there's a spectrum on this issue. This is one of the dividing issues that they can't agree on. Is drinking a Pepsi a sin because it has caffeine and these sorts of things. But if you want to know the by the book, which is what Answering Adventism deals with. I probably should have said that actually back in part one, and I should have probably said it in this part as well. People have to understand that our platform is dealing with by the book official Seventh-day Adventist teaching from primary sources, not every individual SDA out in the world somewhere, because of course we recognize and understand, having grown up in that world, I grew up in various pockets of the Adventist world, so I got to see all sorts of it. I saw people that were vegetarians. I saw people that ate unclean meat. I saw people that were vegans. There are some that are militant. There are some people that this is the hobby horse that they ride. This is what's considered in Adventism an entering wedge doctrine. So eschatology is a big entering wedge doctrine, and then their health message. So you'll see them in lots of towns doing evangelistic outreach where they're doing like a cooking class for like women or these sorts of things, and you may not know it's a Seventh-day Adventist thing until you get a little bit into the fray of it, or further along in the course of the class for however long it is. And then you realize, oh, this is actually like an evangelistic effort where they're trying to connect their health message to the theology and the system. So there's a big spectrum there. By the book teaching is, like I said in part one, you have to get to a point where you are a vegetarian, because you need to demonstrate while on probation that you are fitted for heaven. That doesn't just mean that you get to a sinlessly perfect condition where you have a character that is identical to that of Jesus. That's what Ellen White said. You also have to get to a point where your diet is cleaned up in such a way that you adhere to the heavenly diet. So it's not like militant veganism, but vegetarianism. Veganism is preferred because milk and eggs should ultimately be avoided.
And just for clarity, when you say probation, is that, or when you're quoting the sources saying probation, is that the entirety of one's mortal life?
Well, here's the thing, and I can get into this a little bit. You have to understand Seventh-day Adventist covenant theology. Okay. So the pioneers, the individuals that systematized Seventh-day Adventist theology, they took Reformed covenant theology, but then filtered it through the great controversy paradigm, creating their own covenant theology. So this gets really confusing for a lot of people, because there's a lot of things that they say that they'll then point to like William Twice, or they'll point to like a Puritan or a reformer and say, well, look, they're saying this over here that Adam and Eve were on probation. But that individual didn't have a great controversy worldview. They weren't using the word probation the same way that the Seventh-day Adventist system is. So probation in their system is essentially this. Adam and Eve were put on a period of probation. The Reformed tradition would agree. The Reformed scholastics would agree on this. That Adam and Eve had Adam done what God told him to do, there would have been a period more than likely where he would have then been rendered secure. But he fell. They then claim that Jesus, part of him coming as the second Adam, was to give man a second probation. I'm going to read a quote here from Ellen White, where this is in Special Testimony to Battle Creek Church on page 32, where she writes, quote, "Death entered the world because of transgression, but Christ gave his life that man should have another trial. He did not die on the cross to abolish the law, but to serve for man a second, but to secure for man a second probation. He did not die to make sin an immortal attribute. He died to secure the right to destroy him that had the power of death, that is, the devil. He suffered the full penalty of a broken law for the whole world. This he did, not that men might continue in transgression, but that they might return to their loyalty and keep God's commandments and his law as the apple of their eye." Close quote. So probation in their model is essentially they do not distinguish between the covenant of grace and the covenant of works. So Adam was in the covenant of works, Reformed theology would say, based on a do this and you'll live, do that and you'll die relational condition. Yeah. Adam broke that and he fell. But the gospel can't be broken. The basis of the new covenant is essentially between the Father and the Son, and neither party in that can fail. It's we see the picture of that in Abraham being passive in the cutting of the covenant that God makes with him. He's asleep, and God himself as the sole agent. It's a unilateral covenant. They don't recognize that in their model, and so they really see the new covenant as a redo of the covenant of works with Adam. That Jesus came to basically make it available for people who can come to him and be given a special ability to now do what you couldn't do without him. And so probation is the period of time that, yes, everyone is on right now. Jesus purchased a second probation, meaning time for people to be saved. But even when you come to the Adventist God, you're still on probation. And probation goes on until the investigative judgment closes. So they don't know when that's going to happen. But when the investigative judgment closes, that's when probation will cease, meaning the opportunity for salvation will close. And while probation is going on, Ellen White had all sorts of advice and commands, essentially, that she said that you have to essentially accomplish while on probation. And the biggest one is in Great Controversy. I believe it's on page 623, where she essentially says the condition that Jesus was in is the condition you will have to be found in when probation closes, because they teach that you will have to stand before God without a mediator.
Hmm. So Trey Fisher, who he was a previous guest on my podcast, I believe is when we were covering the Church of Christ. He mentioned something that has stuck with me. Shout out to Trey if you're listening. He said that, and even it was relevant then, I think it's relevant now. He said that whenever you're dealing with a cult, the closer you get in proximity to orthodoxy, the more fiery it gets. Because you have, we're not talking, I mean, we made the little small joke, obviously, about like space and the Sabbath and operating Thetans and stuff like that. But the reality is that when you're dealing with something like Mormonism or Scientology or Jim Jones, stuff that's like, it's way out there. So that's safe. That's safe to talk about. It's when you start getting closer and you get into topics like the Church of Christ or like Hebrew roots or something that's in very much close proximity people that people are very much ingrained in. It seems to be very much the case too in this conversation, because as listening to you, this is, for me, I feel like I am on one level, I am drinking from the fire hose, learning a lot from you today, which I very much appreciate. But it almost feels like it's, listening here for the first time in real time, it's like 80-20 about terms and discussions of things that it sounds like I agree with. And I'm picking up on maybe 10 to 15% that's like, ooh, there's kind of a red flag there. But that also comes from me like having a level of familiarity given the broad variety we've covered on cultish. So it does seem that that's the real challenge when it comes to this whole conversation with Adventism, and you could probably reciprocate being on your channel, all the stuff that you cover, is that it's very murky because it's in some levels it seems so close, but when you start to kind of get into that get into the like neurosurgeon and trying to remove like a neurological tumor or something like that, you'll find out, no, it's very, very different. I think that's a really interesting observation.
Yeah, and that's why I always tell people that, unlike Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc., this theology is a lot more dangerous because it's closer to the truth. A counterfeit that's closer to the truth is a lot more dangerous than one that's further away from the truth, and that's really kind of what you were getting at there. It's just. Yeah, there's so much. And when you start to peel back the layers, you start to realize that literally all of Adventist theology has some sort of influence, and it's defined through the great controversy paradigm. So probation, covenant theology, just all of it. It's all filtered through that. So the average SDA doesn't necessarily understand all this stuff. And I want to continue to hammer that because I know there's going to be tons of Adventists that comment on this that are, fuming mad. That's not what we teach. That's not what we believe. Okay, you can come onto our live show and you can challenge the sources when we do open mics. But the point being is at a systematic level, this is what is being taught. And unless you really understand that whole pre-earth origin narrative and how that influences later redemptive history, Christians don't have that pre-earth narrative that they do influencing their understanding of the Bible. You will continue to talk past one another and oftentimes think you're saying the same thing.
Awesome. Well, I think this is a good place to wrap up here because I know we're running time. I know you have to go grab your son, which is totally understandable given the time of new fatherhood that I'm dealing with myself. But why don't we do this? We'll wrap up here. This will be the second part of a conversation. Again, we're doing a broad overview. It feels like at the same time, it feels very in-depth. We did a lot more in-depth from last time as we had a primary focal point with Colleen and Nikki of Ellen G. White, the Millerites, and then kind of talking about Walter Martin and his history of the Seventh-Day Adventist. This is the perfect continuation. I'm very grateful for this. So we're going to jump in more further in depth in part 3. I know there's things that we want to talk about, get your perspective on, even though I was talking about in a previous series, the investigative judgment. We'll go more in depth with that. Hopefully we'll talk more about the law and the gospel, and we'll jump into some other things that will be a great controversy, if I can throw in a pun there. So all that being said, tell people again, where can they find you? This is the second episode, and people may be familiar, given you have a very familiar background. I love the background of your studio, by the way. Where can people find you at?
Yeah, two main places. Answeringadventism.com. You will find all sorts of articles and resources that essentially link you to primary source documentation. Everything in red is hyperlinked. So go there, explore to your heart's content. Again, the whole goal and the whole focus is ultimately on the body of Christ. It's not actually in the bullseye sense is Christians, not necessarily Adventists. So it's written in such a way to try and help you kind of wade through the theological fog. So check that out, answeringadventism.com, as well as YouTube. That is where all of our video content goes. And then it's also linked onto the website as well. You can just go on YouTube and type in Answering Adventism, or I believe the YouTube URL is youtube.com/@Answering Adventism.
All right, so all that being said, thank you all for listening in. As a reminder, Cultish is a 100% crowd-funded ministry by listeners like you. It's because of your generous giving and support that we can have programs like this to be able to given out to the masses without any sort of paywall, so it can be available for free for those who are looking for answers. So if you want to be a part of our mission, go to thecultistshow.com, and you can click on the donate tab and give as you choose to do so. All that being said, thank you all for listening in. We'll talk to you all again in part 3, where we go further down the rabbit hole of all things Adventism. Talk to you all soon.